Hello to all our wonderful listeners, and welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories. We sincerely appreciate your continuous support. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization features, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoy our story today, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our dedicated team can pay for their daily living expenses and keep creating these thrilling sci-fi adventures for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the direct PayPal link found in the video description or the comments section below. They looked at my lack of claws, my blunt teeth, and my soft skin, and they confidently assumed I was prey. They genuinely believed the crushing gravity of the toxic gas giant outside our hull was the most lethal force in this sector. They were entirely wrong. The most dangerous entity on Tartarus Station is a human engineer who has finally run out of patience. My name is Ares Ayers. I am the sole human electromechanical engineer assigned to the Tartarus Deep Core Energy Mining Station. Our facility does not orbit a peaceful blue world. We hang precariously suspended deep within the churning, highly toxic atmospheric soup of a massive gas giant. The atmospheric pressure raging just outside the reinforced hull bulkheads could crush a heavy military cruiser into a sphere of solid scrap metal in under 10 seconds. Inside the station, the environment is barely any better. The air is perpetually heavy and stifling, constantly vibrating with the deafening drone of the massive industrial turbines that harvest the planetary core energy. The metallic corridors constantly smell of scorched ozone, leaking hydraulic fluid, and the stale sweat of 1,000 overworked alien species. The sense of isolation is absolute. I am entirely alone, surrounded by billions of cubic miles of lethal emerald storms, completely cut off from the rest of the civilized galaxy. The Tartarus Station is firmly controlled by the Vraxis. They are a species of massive reptilian behemoths, their entire bodies encased in thick, impenetrable armored scales. A fully grown Vraxis stands over 8 feet tall and easily weighs more than 4 times my own body mass. Their fundamental nature is inherently brutal and merciless. They do not manage the facility through logistics or diplomacy. They govern through pure, overwhelming physical dominance and the constant application of fear. To the Vraxis management, the smaller worker species on this station are nothing more than expendable biological cogs in the grand machinery of their profit margins. They utilize extreme violence as their primary motivational tool, physically oppressing anyone who lacks the sheer bulk to fight back. The Vraxis foremen take a particular sadistic pleasure in tormenting me. They routinely and deliberately restrict my daily rations of clean, synthesized oxygen. They look down at my bipedal frame, my lack of natural armor, and my relatively small stature, and they sneer. They constantly broadcast through the localized comms. Weak creatures from soft mud worlds do not require the privilege of full air capacity. Almost every single work shift leaves me gasping for air, leaning heavily against the corridor walls. A dull, throbbing headache constantly pounds behind my eyes from the dangerous carbon dioxide buildup in the lower engineering sectors. My muscles ache constantly from oxygen deprivation. I endure their harsh insults, their heavy shoves, and the constant burning sensation in my lungs. I keep my expression entirely blank. They look at my silence, and they proudly interpret it as complete submission. The stifling, suffocating tension finally reached an explosive breaking point during the middle of the 3rd rotational shift. A tiny, avian engineer from the Zephyr species, a fragile creature standing barely 3 feet tall, accidentally dropped a heavy plasma welder onto the grated metal floor. The tool clattered loudly, the sound echoing sharply over the low hum of the generators. A pack of 4 Vraxis enforcers instantly swarmed the terrified, harmless creature. They did not issue a verbal reprimand or dock his pay. They battered him with absolute, unrestrained savagery. I stood frozen at my workstation, forced to listen to the sickening, wet snap of hollow, avian bones breaking under the impact of massive scaled fists. They kicked his frail body across the steel grating, leaving a streak of bright blue blood behind. The Zephyr engineer cried out in a high-pitched, agonizing wail. His delicate feathered wings bent at unnatural, grotesque angles. The Vraxis simply laughed, a deep, resonant guttural sound that vibrated through the metal decking of the maintenance bay. My hands instinctively clenched into extremely tight fists inside my heavy insulated work gloves. A primal, burning rage screamed in the darkest corners of my mind, desperately urging me to charge across the room and bash their reptilian skulls in with my heavy magnetic arc wrench. The adrenaline spiked hard in my veins, demanding immediate violence, but rushing blindly into a physical confrontation against 4 armored giants would only result in my own immediate and violently messy death. I forced myself to swallow the rising tide of anger, deliberately pushing it deep down into my stomach to let it fester and condense. I deliberately kept my head down, pretending to focus intently on repairing the damaged power conduits in front of me. Instead of intervening in a reckless blaze of glory, I let my neural retinal implant silently interface with the station network. I began meticulously compiling a comprehensive structural schematic of the entire Tartarus facility. I mapped out every single security camera blind spot, located every high-pressure atmospheric junction, and identified the manual overrides for every localized gravity generator. The Vraxis enforcers wiped the blood from their claws, utterly convinced that I was ignoring the sheer cruelty out of pathetic human cowardice. They had absolutely no idea that I was not hiding. I was quietly preparing a very lethal battlefield. The brutality did not stop with simply shattering hollow bones. The largest of the Vraxis enforcers, a heavily scarred brute named Kale, clearly decided that inflicting physical agony was entirely insufficient for his purposes. He demanded absolute psychological subjugation from every single entity in the room. With a sickeningly casual flick of his massive, heavily clawed wrist, Kale reached down and firmly gripped the primary life support valve, located on the collar of the Zephyr engineer's environmental suit. The fragile avian let out a gurgling, wet shriek as Kale violently wrenched the delicate locking mechanism sideways. The heavy synthetic fabric of the protective suit tore completely open down the center. A loud, sharp hiss echoed intensely through the maintenance sector as the localized atmospheric pressure equalizer immediately failed. Kale proudly held up the torn piece of the vital breathing apparatus like a gruesome battlefield trophy. He deliberately locked his cold, reptilian gaze onto the terrified crowd of hundreds of assorted worker species who were huddled tightly together in the shadows of the machinery. He was intentionally forcing every single one of us to bear witness to our own inherent inferiority and total helplessness. The unspoken message was completely unmistakable. Any form of defiance would be instantly met with the absolute stripping of survival gear, leaving the defiant victim to suffocate slowly and agonizingly in the deeply toxic ambient air of the lower station levels. The time for passive observation and strategic patience was officially over. The calculated risk probability of inaction suddenly shifted from acceptable to highly critical. I calmly unclipped the heavy industrial safety tether from my reinforced waist belt and stepped out from behind the massive primary coolant conduit. My physical movements were entirely devoid of any hesitation, trembling, or wasted kinetic energy. Every single step I took was perfectly measured, completely silent, and lethally precise. I walked directly into the center of the brightly illuminated maintenance bay, deliberately placing my physical body squarely between Kale and the gasping, dying Zephyr worker. I did not yell to get his attention. I did not adopt a recognizable defensive martial arts stance. I stood perfectly relaxed, my shoulders loose, my hands hanging freely and loosely at my sides. "Release the worker immediately and step back from the broken pressure seal," I stated clearly. My voice was completely flat, resembling a block of solid ice effortlessly cutting through the heavy, heat-vibrating air of the humming machinery. The utter lack of primal fear or submissive tremor in my tone caused a sudden, highly unnatural silence to crash down over the entire lower engineering deck. Cale stopped laughing and stared down at me, his vertically slit pupils dilating in genuine, unadulterated disbelief. A human, statistically categorized as the absolute weakest creature currently residing on the station, was issuing a direct, uncompromising command to an apex predator. A low, heavily vibrating growl started deep within his armored chest cavity, quickly erupting into a deafening, roaring laugh that sprayed thick, acidic saliva across the metal grating between us. "You incredibly fragile little meat sack," Cale bellowed loudly, his voice sounding exactly like grinding tectonic plates tearing against each other. "Do you truly want to share his pathetic fate? I will crush your tiny skull like a ripe, soft nutrient pod." He did not pause for any further dialogue. Kyle violently lunged forward, a creature weighing easily over 800 pounds, clad entirely in thick, natural armor that was biologically harder than industrial titanium, charged at me with terrifying, explosive velocity. His massive, scythe-like claws swung in a wide, incredibly lethal arc, aiming with brutal precision directly for the center of my unprotected face. The sheer kinetic energy backing his heavy strike was easily enough to instantly decapitate a light cargo loading mech. He fully, confidently expected me to either freeze completely in primal terror or attempt a panicked, utterly futile dodge. I did absolutely neither of those predictable things. I completely and consciously ignored the biological instinct to rely on sheer muscle power against an opponent possessing exactly 4 times my own body mass. Instead, I relied entirely on structural physics and environmental manipulation. Exactly 0.4 seconds before his razor-sharp claws could make physical contact with my skin, I firmly triggered the heavy-duty magnetic locking system built deeply into the thick soles of my engineering boots. The powerful electromagnets instantly clamped onto the steel deck, grating with a holding force of several thousand pounds per square inch. My body was instantly, unbreakably anchored to the floor. Simultaneously, using a micro-expression, my neural retinal implant quickly accessed the localized gravity control node, positioned directly beneath Cale's massive, heavily charging feet. I violently and instantly inverted the gravitational polarity in a precise 2-yard radius directly in his immediate path. The sudden, total loss of all downward friction threw his massive, forward-driving kinetic momentum completely out of his control. As he stumbled awkwardly forward into the unexpected zero-gravity pocket, I quickly twisted my torso, reaching out and grabbing his extended, thick armored wrist. I smoothly utilized his own devastating, unstoppable forward velocity, smoothly combining it with the unbreakable leverage of my firmly anchored stance, and violently redirected his entire, immense mass straight over my right shoulder. Cale crashed onto the solid steel decking with a catastrophic impact that literally shook the structural foundations of the entire sector. The sickening sound of his thick, supposedly impenetrable armor plating violently fracturing echoed through the cavernous room like a detonating thermal mining charge. Before his massive, deeply confused reptilian brain could even begin to process the sudden, violent shift in spatial orientation and the resulting physical agony, I instantly disengaged my magnetic boot locks and dropped my knee heavily directly onto the newly exposed, unarmored joint of his upper thorax. He gasped loudly, drawing in air to unleash a furious roar. but my hands were already moving in a blur. I delivered exactly 3 rapid, mathematically precise strikes using the solid, hardened steel casing of my heavy diagnostic tool. I explicitly did not aim for his thick outer armor. I targeted the incredibly soft, highly sensitive biological blind spots, located perfectly between his thick cranial plates and his vulnerable secondary respiratory nodes. The dense nerve clusters hidden there were highly sensitive and completely unprotected by evolution. The heavy, blunt impacts instantly and totally paralyzed his auxiliary breathing muscles. Kale, the terrifying, undefeated nightmare of Tartarus Station, let out a pathetic, high-pitched, wheezing choke. His enormous, terrifying body went entirely limp against the floor, his yellow eyes rolling back into his skull as his central nervous system forcefully rebooted itself from the extreme, localized trauma. The entire crowded mining bay stood absolutely frozen in complete, paralyzed shock. I stood up very slowly, calmly wiping a single stray drop of leaked hydraulic coolant from my cheek with the back of my glove. I looked directly up at the remaining 3 Vraxis enforcers, who were now standing entirely frozen, their posture rigid with sudden, unexplainable terror. You critically and fundamentally miscalculated the basic operating parameters of human biology. I projected my voice clearly and loudly across the silent room, using highly precise, clinical technical terminology. My species originally evolved on a Class 9 planetary death world. Our native gravity is incredibly crushing, our atmosphere is highly corrosive, and our local biological fauna is hyper-aggressive. We absolutely did not survive our evolutionary history by growing thick scales or by utilizing overwhelming physical size. We survived and conquered through extreme bone density, highly redundant nervous systems, and an entirely unparalleled instinctual capacity for advanced kinetic calculation. What you ignorantly interpret as physical weakness is merely extreme, refined biological efficiency. You rely entirely on predictable brute force. I rely entirely on applied physics, kinetic leverage, and the inherent structural failure points of your specific anatomy. I slowly raised my hand and pointed the sharp steel tip of my diagnostic tool directly at the chest of the closest, visibly trembling Vraxis enforcer. If any single one of you ever attempts to touch another innocent worker on this deck again, I will thoroughly and permanently demonstrate exactly how easily a human engineer can fully dismantle a Vraxis respiratory system. Now, pick up your broken garbage from my floor and leave my engineering bay immediately. The 3 remaining enforcers did not attempt to avenge their fallen leader. They stared at Kale's broken form, then looked back at my unblinking expression in sheer terror. Slowly, they reached down and dragged his massive bulk across the grated floor. But just before the heavy maintenance doors slid shut behind them, the tallest of the 3 paused. He turned his heavily armored head toward me, his yellow eyes narrowing into cold, venomous slits. "You have made a fatal error, human," he hissed, his voice echoing menacingly through the silent bay. "Tartarus is an infinitely large facility. Accidents happen every single shift. You will never see the dark corner that claims you. This station will serve as your permanent, rusted tomb." Their retreat was temporary, a mere tactical withdrawal. I knew they would not let such a massive public humiliation stand. Moving quickly and silently, I gathered my tools and retreated into a highly classified, secondary maintenance crawlspace hidden deep behind the primary exhaust manifolds. I needed to understand exactly why the Vraxis were operating with such unchecked, arrogant impunity. Using a modified diagnostic cable, I physically bypassed the standard monitoring relays and spliced my neural implant directly into the station's ghost network. This was a forgotten architectural layer of base code, abandoned during the initial construction phase of the facility over 50 years ago. Operating in complete digital silence, I began sifting through their highly encrypted work logs and daily operational manifests. The raw data streams cascaded across my retinal display in a rapid blur of complex alien cryptography. My mind processed the information methodically, looking for structural anomalies and hidden patterns. It took exactly 2 hours of deep data diving before I found the catastrophic structural flaw. There was a massive, highly deliberate discrepancy in the core energy flow. The daily harvesting quotas showed maximum extraction yields from the planetary core, but the official storage manifests registered a consistent, heavy loss. Exactly 18.5% of the highly volatile plasma energy was simply vanishing from the closed-loop system every single rotational cycle. I ran a complex cross-reference matrix, pairing the energy loss timestamps with the station incident reports. The horrifying truth materialized in the glowing code right before my eyes. The Vraxis were not merely brutalizing the smaller workers out of pure sadistic pleasure or twisted racial superiority. They were intentionally orchestrating localized system failures and highly fatal workplace accidents. The brutal death of a worker or the catastrophic destruction of a minor substation provided the perfect digital smokescreen to hide the massive energy siphons. They were deliberately bleeding the Tartarus reactor dry, stealing raw, unrefined fusion plasma, and selling it to underground smuggling syndicates on the cosmic black market for billions of credits. The terrified workers were not just collateral damage. They were the necessary blood sacrifices intentionally used to cover up a highly lucrative, massive embezzlement operation. Suddenly, the gentle hum of my hidden data terminal spiked into a harsh, high-pitched whine. Before my neural implant could even register the incoming malicious countermeasure, the heavy titanium blast doors at both ends of my crawl space slammed shut with bone-rattling force. The heavy magnetic locks engaged instantly, with a loud, definitive clank. I was trapped inside Sector 4, a highly restricted thermal purification chamber. The ambient air ventilation completely ceased. The overhead warning lights immediately shifted to a blinding, flashing crimson. A deep, mechanical voice resonated loudly over the localized intercom. It was not an automated hazard warning. It was the Vraxis, through the thick, reinforced, transparent aluminum observation window located on the upper deck. I saw Kale. His chest was heavily strapped with thick medical braces from our previous violent encounter, but his reptilian face was twisted into an incredibly smug, vicious grin. "Did you honestly think a primitive monkey could breach our secure network without triggering a localized quarantine trap?" Kale taunted, his voice dripping with absolute malice and dark amusement. "We have manually overridden the station containment protocols. We are currently venting raw, unshielded thermal radiation directly into your chamber. Let us see if your supposedly superior biological efficiency can survive a localized ambient temperature of 400 degrees. We are going to watch your soft, pathetic human skin melt right off your bones. And then we will simply log your complete vaporization as another unfortunate industrial accident." The temperature inside the chamber was already skyrocketing exponentially. The metallic walls began to emit a dull, terrifying cherry-red glow. My heavy environmental suit began to sweat profusely from the inside, the internal cooling units whining loudly as they rapidly overloaded. The air grew visibly distorted, shimmering with lethal, invisible waves of pure thermal radiation. I felt the surface of my skin beginning to blister painfully under the intense, baking heat. Most species would have panicked instantly, screaming wildly and pounding their fists against the unbreakable transparent aluminum until their bones shattered. I maintained complete, absolute silence. I consciously slowed my heart rate and conserved every single ounce of my breath and my analytical mental focus. I dropped to my knees, shielding my core from the direct ambient heat, and instantly ripped open the heavy casing of my custom-built, highly encrypted communicator. Inside was a dense, Military-grade microfusion battery. My hands moved with desperate, mechanical precision. I forcefully pulled the raw, highly exposed energy core from the device. I did not try to break the locked doors. That would be completely futile. Instead, I jammed the sparking fusion core directly into the chamber's localized magnetic shielding node, positioned securely in the floor grating. I deliberately bypassed the safety regulators and violently inverted the localized magnetic field. The chamber was originally designed to safely contain radiation, but by forcefully reversing the polarity and feeding it the massive, deeply unstable power of the microfusion battery, I turned the entire sealed room into a focused thermal reflector. The ambient radiation did not dissipate into my body. It rapidly condensed into a highly concentrated, invisible beam of pure, destructive kinetic heat, bouncing aggressively off the inverted magnetic walls and shooting straight back up through the only unshielded conduit in the room, the two-way communication relay, leading directly into the Vraxis observation deck. Kale's smug, triumphant smile vanished a fraction of a second before the primary control panel situated directly in front of him catastrophically detonated. The forcefully focused thermal feedback loop blew the entire heavy console apart in a massive, deafening shower of molten slag and blinding electrical sparks. The resulting localized explosion instantly melted the main electronic locks on their side of the sector, plunging their control deck into absolute darkness and chaos, while simultaneously shorting out the containment grid holding me captive. They wanted to watch me burn, but I had just completely incinerated their entire master control system. The concentrated thermal blast heavily shattered the thick observation deck windows located directly above my confinement cell. Heavy, ear-piercing emergency alarms instantly shrieked through the long metallic corridors, completely replacing the flashing crimson hazard lights with the stark, blinding white strobes, indicative of a catastrophic structural failure. I could clearly hear the heavy, panicked footsteps of the massive Vraxis enforcers retreating rapidly down the upper gangways, their arrogant bravado entirely evaporating in the face of raw, uncontrolled fire. The sudden destruction of their master control system completely severed the manual electronic lock holding my chamber sealed. The heavy titanium blast doors hissed loudly as their magnetic seals violently failed, and they slowly ground open on their heavy tracks. I staggered out into the main engineering corridor, my burning lungs desperately pulling in huge, agonizing gasps of the relatively cooler, heavily filtered ambient air. My protective environmental suit was scorched completely black, and my tired muscles trembled uncontrollably from the extreme thermal stress I had just endured. Just as my blurred vision slowly began to stabilize in the dim light, a small, unremarkable shadow quietly detached itself from a dark alcove located near the primary coolant line. I recognized him almost instantly. It was a lower deck maintenance technician, a highly nervous, four-eyed Graxian worker whom I had quietly hidden from a brutal Vraxis patrol just 2 rotation cycles ago. I lowered my defensive guard for exactly 1/4 of a second, fully expecting him to offer immediate medical assistance. That microscopic, human hesitation was nearly fatal. The technician lunged forward with highly uncharacteristic, surprising speed, and forcefully drove a thick, high-pressure pneumatic syringe directly into the unarmored, soft synthetic seam of my protective neck seal. A terrible, freezing cold sensation instantly flooded my right jugular vein, rapidly spreading downward through my central nervous system like highly pressurized liquid nitrogen. I collapsed heavily onto the cold steel grating, my legs instantly turning into useless, entirely numb dead weight. The Graxian technician backed away rapidly, his 4 dark eyes blown wide with terrified, overwhelming guilt, his multi-jointed hands shaking uncontrollably as he dropped the empty metal syringe onto the floor. I am so deeply sorry, human, he stammered loudly, his weak voice cracking violently under the immense psychological weight of his profound cowardice. Kyle and the upper management cast have officially initiated the Tartarus Total Facility Purge Protocol. They manually set the primary planetary plasma core to reach critical mass overload in exactly 25 minutes. They are going to completely vaporize the entire mining station to permanently erase all physical evidence of their massive black market energy smuggling ring. Millions of innocent, hard-working laborers will burn alive. They gave me a terrible choice. They offered me a single, highly secured boarding pass on their personal, heavily armored evacuation shuttle. The only absolute condition was that I had to make completely sure you did not survive to disable the core detonation sequence. I want to live. I just want to return to my home world. He was rapidly hyperventilating, desperately trying to verbally justify the cold-blooded murder of the only entity on this station who had ever physically protected him. The highly concentrated alien neurotoxin was incredibly aggressive. My peripheral vision rapidly tunneled into total, suffocating blackness. My lungs suddenly felt like they were being crushed slowly inside a heavy industrial hydraulic vise, violently fighting for every single cubic inch of oxygen. The chemical agent was specifically engineered to totally sever the vital neural pathways between the brain and the voluntary muscle groups, effectively burying the conscious victim alive within their own quickly paralyzing flesh. Almost any other alien species in the known galaxy would have simply closed their eyes and peacefully surrendered to the deep, dark void of death. But the terrified Graxian and his brutal Vraxis masters fundamentally misunderstood the deepest, most primal, deeply aggressive core of human biology. As my respiratory system began to violently shut down, the absolute oldest, most violent survival mechanism deeply embedded within my evolutionary DNA violently woke up. My adrenal glands suddenly flooded my dying bloodstream with a massive, highly concentrated, lethal dose of pure epinephrine. It was absolutely not a gentle, healing wave. It was an explosive, highly aggressive, biological counterattack. My heart violently hammered against my ribcage like a trapped, heavy mechanical piston. The sheer chemical fury of the human adrenaline physically battled the alien neurotoxin for total control of my neural synapses, creating an agonizing, physically tearing sensation right down to the microscopic, molecular level of my nerve endings. I could not speak a single word. I could barely see the grated floor beneath my face. But the overwhelming, highly explosive surge of internal adrenaline granted me back exactly 3 inches of localized movement in my right arm. It was barely enough distance, but I absolutely did not need a wide range of athletic motion. I only needed to reach my heavily damaged, heavy-duty utility belt, gritting my teeth together so intensely hard that I could actually hear my own molars cracking under the immense bone pressure. I painfully dragged my right hand down toward the industrial plasma welding tool still firmly clipped to my hip. My fingers were completely, totally numb, feeling exactly like heavily padded blocks of dead, useless wood. But pure, ingrained muscle memory entirely took over the complex physical operation. I awkwardly fumbled with the heavy metallic casing, violently tearing away the thick protective rubber insulation to completely expose the raw, highly dangerous, high-voltage ignition coil located inside. The sheer physical pain tearing through my entire nervous system was absolutely blinding. A complete, highly destructive sensory overload that would have easily driven a lesser alien mind completely insane. I forcefully shoved my right hand upwards, pressed the aggressively sparking, violently raw electrical node directly against my own insulated chest plate, right over my furiously beating heart, and I fully depressed the heavy mechanical activation trigger. A massive, totally unshielded surge of pure industrial electrical current violently blasted directly into my chest cavity. The massive, uncontrolled shockwave instantly forced my paralyzed diaphragm to violently contract, forcefully expelling the stale, toxic air from my lungs, and simultaneously kick-starting my failing neural pathways with overwhelming, utterly brutal electrical force. The highly complex alien paralytic chemical was instantly burned completely away from my sensitive nerve receptors by the sheer, raw voltage and the massive secondary bodily spike of pure survival adrenaline. I violently convulsed on the hard steel floor, gasping hungrily and loudly for air, as physical feeling explosively returned to my limbs like a million deeply burning metallic needles. I slowly, methodically pushed my body up off the metal grating, my stiff joints popping loudly in the quiet corridor. Thick, dark crimson blood freely flowed from a deeply bitten lower lip, trailing slowly down my chin and dripping heavily onto my scorched armor plating. I slowly raised my heavy head and locked my eyes directly onto the terrified Graxian technician. The purely primal, highly focused murderous intent burning deeply within my human gaze contained absolutely no mercy, zero empathy, and entirely no hesitation. I did not need to say a single word. The sheer, overwhelming, highly palpable aura of absolute violence radiating from my bleeding, heavily electrified form completely and utterly shattered his fragile, alien mind. The traitor let out a pathetic, completely broken whimper, his weak knees buckling entirely under his own weight. He collapsed into a pathetic, trembling heap on the cold, metal floor, pressing his face completely against the dirty grating, weeping uncontrollably, and begging desperately for a mercy he knew he absolutely did not deserve. The deep core overload protocol initiated by the highest management caste was absolutely not a quiet, unseen digital countdown. Tartarus Station immediately began to scream loudly in structural agony as its primary infrastructural integrity began to violently fail under the massive churning atmospheric pressure of the incredibly hostile gas planet located just outside the hull. The heavy magnetic repulsor grids, which had previously held the lethal emerald storms at a safe distance, were now rapidly losing power. This allowed the immense external gravity to violently crush inward against the slowly weakening titanium bulkheads. Entire upper deck sections tore completely away, creating a terrifying, agonizing screech of rending metal that heavily resonated through the steel floorboards beneath my boots. Massive structural support beams violently twisted like cheap copper wire, raining incredibly sharp, jagged shards of metallic shrapnel directly down into the lower transit corridors. The once highly organized working environment was rapidly transforming into a highly lethal, completely unpredictable maze of sudden electrical fires, violently venting cryogenic gases, and completely shattered architecture. High above the spreading chaos safely locked within the heavily reinforced executive docking bay, the Vraxis High Command was desperately attempting to rapidly initiate the emergency launch sequence of their heavily armored private evacuation shuttle. I could clearly and easily monitor their frantic digital commands cascading through my active neural retinal implant. They fully intended to simply leave billions of credits worth of utterly destroyed infrastructure and many thousands of burning, terrified laborers completely behind as they comfortably retreated to the absolute safety of the outer orbit. They frantically initiated the primary thruster ignition sequence. The incredibly heavy engines roared violently to life, shaking the hangar deck, but the massive magnetic docking clamps absolutely refused to release the ship. Exactly 2 rotation cycles ago, while I was supposedly merely repairing a minor sensory array located near their private hangar entrance, I had discreetly hardwired a highly aggressive, deeply complex, malicious logic bomb directly into the shuttle navigation matrix. The extremely advanced alien computer now firmly and unbreakably believed the immediate external environment directly outside the bay doors was entirely composed of solid, impenetrable rock. The cruel Vraxis elite were completely permanently trapped within their own luxurious escape vessel, totally blind to the open cosmic void located just beyond the hangar doors. I left the weeping Graxian technician completely behind in the dark and stepped fully into the dense, heavily choking black smoke that was violently pouring from the severely ruptured ventilation shafts. I did not run. A desperate, terrified prey animal runs blindly from danger. A highly calculated, highly focused apex predator stalks its target. I move swiftly through the burning, ruined corridors entirely, like an unseen, invisible phantom, deeply exploiting my relatively tiny physical size to easily slip through heavily mangled maintenance hatches and completely shattered service ducts that the massive, bulky Vraxis enforcers could not even begin to hope to access. A heavily armed reptilian guard came charging aggressively down Sector 9, his heavy particle rifle raised high, frantically scanning the incredibly thick smoke for any visible targets. He never even saw my shadow. I waited patiently in the dark ceiling rafters until he stepped directly over a high-capacity, heavy industrial steam release valve. With a single, mathematically precise, mental command sent through my neural link, I violently purged the superheated vapor directly upward. A massive blinding geyser of highly pressurized boiling moisture instantly blasted completely through the heavy floor, grating violently, cooking the guard, trapped inside his own thick natural armor, long before he could even draw a single breath to scream. Another heavily panicked enforcer, deeply startled by the sudden violent hiss of the steam trap, blindly fired his heavy weapon directly into the empty shadows. I was already positioned firmly directly above his head, securely anchored to the heavy ceiling pipes using my magnetic boots. I simply released the heavy magnetic lock on a massive 2-ton overhead structural support beam right exactly as he walked underneath my position. The heavy titanium completely crushed his upper torso, rendering him instantly and permanently neutralized. The overall psychological atmosphere among the remaining Vraxis thugs rapidly and completely disintegrated into total chaos. The deeply ingrained, incredibly arrogant contempt they usually held for my species entirely evaporated into pure, unadulterated primal terror. They were biologically designed and culturally trained to fight massive physical brawls on wide-open, heavily contested battlefields. They had absolutely zero evolutionary defense against a tiny, completely silent ghost who was systematically utilizing their own massive industrial station as a highly lethal, completely unpredictable weapon against them. Their localized communications channels rapidly devolved into chaotic, heavily panicked shouting and desperate pleas for backup. They simply could not track my extremely fluid movements. 1 second, a heavy plasma conduit would mysteriously explode directly behind a heavily armed patrol. The very next second, a localized gravity well would suddenly violently invert, forcefully slamming 2 heavily armored guards into a solid steel bulkhead with incredible bone-crushing velocity. They began firing wildly and frantically at completely empty shadows, deeply terrified of the unseen human phantom, relentlessly dismantling their entire security force, one precise strike at a time. The arrogant hunters had officially and entirely become the desperately hunted. I systematically funneled the spreading chaos completely, sealing off specific heavy blast doors, and deliberately manipulating the rapidly spreading electrical fires to aggressively herd my final primary target. Kyle had miraculously survived the earlier control room explosion, heavily scarred and breathing erratically through a severely damaged secondary respiratory node. He totally abandoned his trapped superiors, and his heavily panicked men, desperately fleeing downward toward the primary fusion core, perhaps frantically seeking a manual override to completely stop the impending planetary detonation. I deliberately allowed him to reach the main reactor control room entirely unopposed. As his heavy, clawed feet finally crossed the final metallic threshold, I manually severed the heavy power couplings, connecting to the main access door located directly behind him. The massive 2-foot-thick slab of solid durasteel violently slammed shut completely, locking the heavy magnetic security bolts with a deafening, incredibly final boom. Kale spun around rapidly his yellow eyes suddenly wide, with absolute dawning desperation. The massive, highly reinforced circular room offered absolutely zero alternative exit routes. The incredibly volatile, highly unstable plasma core raged furiously in the center of the massive chamber, casting a brilliant, blindingly bright, crimson light over his heavily burned, deeply terrified face. The deafening, piercing shriek of the final proximity alarms completely drowned out the low, dying hum of the crumbling station. I slowly stepped out from the dark shadows behind the heavy coolant control console, completely blocking his only possible path back to the locked blast door. I did not hold a single weapon in my hands. I merely looked directly and coldly into his highly panicked eyes, heavily bathed in the violent red glow of the failing reactor, and I let him fully realize that his massive, supposedly impenetrable industrial fortress had just officially become his inescapable execution chamber. Cale realized with absolute clarity that his reign of terror was permanently finished. There were absolutely no more heavily armed guards to hide behind, and no heavily armored bulkheads left to protect him. The massive Vraxis Enforcer stared at the heavy titanium blast door I had just permanently sealed behind him. A low, guttural growl of pure, unadulterated desperation vibrated violently from deep within his heavily scarred chest cavity. His yellow reptilian eyes darted frantically around the circular reactor room, desperately seeking any possible escape route. Finding absolutely nothing but solid durasteel walls and the blinding crimson glare of the highly unstable plasma core, he finally turned his massive, terrifying gaze back toward me. If he was going to die inside this crumbling industrial tomb, he fully intended to take the tiny human engineer straight to the absolute depths of the void with him. He roared, loudly shouting, "I will drag you into the dark void with me, human!" before he aggressively pulled out a thick, heavy glass cylinder, filled with a violently glowing synthetic purple fluid. It was a highly illegal, heavily restricted, combat biological stimulant originally engineered for massive, planetary siege warfare. Without a single moment of hesitation, he violently jammed the heavy metallic needle directly into his severely damaged secondary respiratory node. The horrifying physical transformation was utterly immediate and incredibly grotesque. The highly volatile chemical compound violently forcefully rewired his entire biological structure in a matter of seconds. His already massive muscles forcefully expanded, tearing wildly through his thick, natural outer armor. His dark green scales splintered and popped off his flesh, raining down onto the steel grating like shattered ceramic tiles. Toxic purple veins bulged across his upper torso. His agonized, deafening roar shook the heavy dust directly from the ceiling rafters. He was no longer a rational thinking creature. The illicit, heavily concentrated serum had completely forcefully mutated him into a towering, unstoppable, mindless engine of absolute biological destruction. He lowered his massive, incredibly heavy shoulders and charged directly toward me. His heavy, thundering footsteps physically dented the solid steel deck plates with every single terrifying stride. I absolutely did not take a single step backward. I did not attempt to frantically run or desperately hide behind the heavy control consoles. I stood perfectly, incredibly still in the very center of the massive room, calmly watching the horrifying biological nightmare violently barrel toward my position. I reached down to the heavy external power pack firmly attached to my scorched environmental suit. I violently bypassed all the standard safety limiters and manually aggressively engaged the total energy saturation protocol. I forcefully diverted the entire remaining power supply of my heavy engineering rig directly downward, violently channeling the massive raw electrical current straight into the localized gravitational plating embedded securely within the floor. In a single, terrifying instant, I fundamentally altered the basic physics of the entire control room. The heavy steel floor instantly became a highly volatile, completely unstable patchwork minefield of aggressively inverted and heavily crushed localized gravity wells. As Kale aggressively stomped his massive feet into the highly charged zone, his incredible forward momentum violently betrayed him. One heavy foot was aggressively subjected to 3 times the normal planetary gravity, forcefully slamming his heavy knee downward, while his other leg was instantly violently thrown upward by a sudden extreme zero-gravity pocket. The massive, brutal giant violently stumbled, his aggressive charge completely, fundamentally broken by the sheer, chaotic, unpredictable nature of the heavily fractured floor. Yet his massive, sheer forward kinetic energy was absolutely so incredibly immense that he still violently crashed forward. He let out a final deafening, blood-curdling scream, violently throwing his incredibly massive right fist directly toward my fragile human skull. His heavy strike carried enough raw biological power to easily completely pulverize a solid titanium engine block. This was the exact, precise, highly mathematical moment I had been deeply, patiently waiting for. I completely aggressively deactivated my heavy magnetic boots. Instead of desperately dodging away from his lethal strike, I violently forcefully launched my entire physical body directly upward, leaping aggressively straight into the incredibly dangerous path of his incoming fist. At the absolute, very last possible microsecond, I violently twisted my torso midair, forcefully, planting my heavy, steel-reinforced engineering boots directly against the side of his massive incoming arm. I aggressively used his own unstoppable, terrifying forward momentum, heavily pushing off his thick, muscular forearm, to violently alter his targeting trajectory by exactly 4 crucial inches. His massive, glowing, physically enhanced fist entirely completely missed my fragile human body. Instead, his devastating, incredibly powerful strike violently forcefully slammed directly into the ultra-dense, heavy thermal protective casing of the main fusion reactor core positioned right behind me. The highly catastrophic collision between his massive, biologically enhanced brute force and the highly volatile, heavily pressurized energy core instantly created a massively terrifying, completely directed kinetic shockwave. A blinding, heavily concentrated blast of pure, raw physical force violently erupted completely outward, originating exactly from the point of his heavy impact. The incredibly massive shockwave hit Kale with the sheer, terrifying force of a descending heavy orbital drop pod. The sheer concussive pressure violently, fundamentally stripped away every single remaining piece of his once proud, supposedly impenetrable scaly armor. His violently enhanced muscles forcefully ruptured. His heavy, incredibly dense alien bones audibly violently fractured under the completely overwhelming kinetic backslash. The massive, terrifying Vraxis leader was violently, aggressively thrown completely backward, crashing heavily, brutally against the far steel wall. He slowly, agonizingly slid down to the cold floor, entirely, completely broken. The highly illegal serum violently burned out of his system, leaving him incredibly weak, heavily bleeding, and totally physically paralyzed. He slowly, desperately dragged his heavy, broken body forward, leaving a thick, dark trail of blood completely across the floor. He slowly bowed his bruised head, completely submitting at my steel boots. His yellow eyes were entirely, absolutely wide, with pure, unadulterated primal terror. He had finally, truly, comprehensively understood the sheer, incredibly terrifying, unstoppable nature of the absolutely unbreakable human willpower. I looked down at his broken form and stated clearly, "You thought we were weak, and you were entirely wrong." I calmly stepped completely over his broken, pathetic form. I confidently pulled a highly encrypted heavy data storage drive from my belt and forcefully jammed it directly into the master control terminal. My fingers danced across the physical keys, reclaiming absolute control over the Tartarus station. I manually canceled the primary planetary core overload sequence, entirely saving the incredibly massive facility from total, immediate vaporization. I then aggressively, forcefully transmitted petabytes of highly classified internal data, heavily detailing every single illicit energy transfer, every brutally murdered worker, and every single black market transaction directly to the highly secure servers of the High Cosmic Tribunal. Their massive illegal smuggling empire was permanently destroyed in exactly 4 seconds. I then aggressively initiated the localized anti-gravity containment protocol. Heavy containment shields violently, forcefully dropped from the ceiling, permanently securely locking Kale and his remaining corrupt enforcers exactly inside the heavy reactor room. I manually completely severed their local life support heating units, permanently leaving them completely trapped in the slowly freezing, absolutely terrifying total darkness of the rapidly failing lower decks. I walked away, leaving the darkness behind me. I navigated through the damaged corridors toward the secondary industrial hangar. I manually entirely booted up the massive, highly reinforced backup cargo freighter. Thousands of heavily terrified, oppressed alien workers, including the heavily injured Zephyr engineer and the deeply sobbing Graxian technician, rapidly safely boarded the heavy ship. As the incredibly massive engines violently, powerfully roared to life, pushing us entirely safely away from the highly toxic gas giant. I looked back at the heavily crippled Tartarus station. I had successfully, completely brought an incredibly terrifying, brutal alien empire entirely to its knees, without ever needing to fire a single standard weapon. I had definitively, completely proven to the entire heavily watching civilized galaxy that humanity absolutely never, ever backs down in the face of sheer cruelty. Hello again to all our highly valued, amazing listeners, and thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this completely thrilling science fiction journey. We truly, deeply appreciate every single one of you. Please tell us in the comments exactly where you are listening from today, because we deeply love hearing from our global audience. If you truly enjoyed this highly intense story and want to help us keep this channel completely alive, please consider deeply supporting us with just $1. You can easily scan the PayPal QR code directly on your screen right now, or simply click the secure PayPal link located right in the video description or the pinned comment below. Your highly generous $1 contribution entirely pays the vital daily salaries of our incredibly hard-working writing and audio staff, allowing them to securely feed their families and continuously create even more absolutely amazing stories for you to completely enjoy. Thank you deeply and have an absolutely wonderful day.